Hi, and welcome to Starry Woods AstroCast, a podcast all about studying and learning astrology, relating with the cycles and the stars in a deeper, more enchanted way, plus fun astrological ideas and techniques. I'm our host, Tony of the Woods, and this is the third episode, beginning at 7:04 p.m. in my location here in Terre Haute, Indiana. I'm super excited to chat with today's guest, Silverius Materi, interpreter of plays, history, and tarot cards, as well as the stars. Welcome, Silverius.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Happy to have you. Why don't we just dive right in? Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, it's a little bit in my bio there, but I say like the big thing that unites everything I do is interpretation. So in my day job, I am a historical interpreter and sort of like an educator. Like I'm not trained as a teacher, but I think interpretation kind of gets at the same thing. I'm a trained actor, and I think, like I said, that's sort of just like interpreting plays. I, in the past, have been I was a student of American Sign Language, and also have gotten into, over the last few years, tarot, and then eventually astrology. It just all seems to center around Mercury having their fingers pretty deeply in my chart, but that's like the uniting factor of everything I find.
Cool. And real briefly, could you just fill me in on what a historical interpreter does?
Yeah, I'm originally Canadian. I'm in the States now, but I am from Canada. That terminology is like more in Canada. But basically the idea is that you're trying to take, something that is esoteric or abstract to someone, either like a historical event or a time period. Or I work in political buildings. And so you are saying like, this is really weird to you, especially if you're like a fourth grader, which I work with often, or a sixth grader, and you're trying to make it relevant and pertinent to their life. So essentially you're trying to make the people care about this really arcane topic, which they have no reason to care about. So the whole idea is to translate something that is kind of unknown or unknowable into something that is like digestible and pertinent and meaningful to that individual.
Wow, very, very mercurial and,
Yeah.
and very apropos to our discussion today.
Yeah, and on a Wednesday, no less, right? So
right? Yeah. Cool. And if you wanted to share, would you want to share your ascendant, ruler of the ascendant, other placements you find identify you?
Yeah, that's fine by me. I am a Taurus rising, specifically in Taurus 1, and my Venus is in Sagittarius in the 8th. So she's like right in there. But I did mention Mercury's got their fingers pretty kind of all over my chart. They are my mutant figurus, and I was double checking before we started recording today, but my ascendant, my Mars, my moon, my Mercury, my Venus, and my Saturn are all in either a decan ruled by Mercury, either in the Chaldean order or in the triplicity system, or an Egyptian bound that's ruled by Mercury. So they're pretty much everywhere. And I have my Mars is trine within partile trine my Mercury, and they're doing this nice do-si-do where my Mars is in the Mercury ruled decan of Cancer, which is also, his own decan if you go by triplicity, and then Mercury is in Scorpio, not in a Mars ruled decan, but like in his sign. So there's this kind of back and forth there.
Interesting. We might bring that back in a little bit if it becomes relevant later. But cool. So what got you into astrology?
Originally, we've joked about this a little bit. I came to this very backwards. I originally started with tarot. So I've been a tarot reader for about 6 years now, and I've always been interested. I was like looking at tarot cards online the same way you might look at like dirty pictures online when you were a kid. I would totally do the thing where I'd like have a tarot card up on the screen, and my mom would come around the corner and like click to another screen. So I always was interested in that and dove pretty deep into it. And so with tarot, not everyone, but you can start to pick up astrology kind of by osmosis, right? Especially the more you pay attention to things like the Decans or more like esoteric tarot. One of my teachers in tarot is T. Susan Chang, and she is, yeah, really, really well known for like connecting the esoterics of tarot to the cards. So, you know, started to pick up little things here and there from that. And never, ever, honestly, until like this last year, thought that astrology would be something that I was really keenly interested in, because I've been historically pretty ambivalent about the idea of the universe having like a say in, you know, outcomes of stuff, or in who you are, what's like gonna happen to you. But then this last year, I decided to do, well, I guess I should say in 2022, I decided to do a Decan walk. And that was going to start off as just a tarot Decan walk. And I was going to look at, you know, the different grimoire images from throughout history and the names of the tarot cards. And I don't know how, but somewhere in there, I came across the fixed stars, and they just grabbed me. And I have not been able to look back. So really within the last year, my astro literacy has kind of expanded. But like I said, there's things I was able to pick up, but other things I feel like I should go back. And I'm actually doing that now, going back and like restarting, learning kind of like from square one a little bit. So it's this weird mix of like starting with really deep stuff like fixed stars, but still wanting to like go back and refresh how a trine shows up in someone's chart, stuff like that.
Yeah, I can relate to a lot of that, and I'm sure listeners can as well. Getting into tarot and like other aspects of, I guess you could say, occultism or like magical type subjects. You actually made me remember something about myself. Is like in high school, I think I printed out like images of like a whole deck of tarot cards and like cut them and glued them to like cardstock paper. I didn't really go much far with that at that time, but yeah, definitely coming from that sort of background and then going into astrology, you're kind of starting with a lot of depth that I feel like kind of gives you a leg up. At least I feel like it did with me, kind of having that symbolism already sort of like getting baked in a bit more so. Is that something that you kind of experience as well?
Yeah, I think it gives you a different language to pull from, right? Like sometimes you can look at a planet placement or something like that and go, okay, well, Mars can mean, you know, half a dozen things on any given day. But like recently, for example, I've been kind of going back and doing this practice where I look at the ruling planet of the day, and looking at the first planetary hour, I say, okay, like what house is it in? What sign is it in? What star is feeding it by conjunction, right? So specifically by the kind of ecliptic degree, and then saying what aspects or is it making to other planets or other things like that. So it's nice to go, okay, you know, today is Mercury, and where I was located, they were in the first in Aries, and they weren't making too many aspects at that first hour, but it was nice to say, okay, so, okay, Mercury is the magician, and they're in the realm of the emperor. And what does that tell me, right? And they're specifically in the first decan, so they're associated with like kind of Two of Wandsy type things. How does Mercury feel about being in this place that's being kind of administered by Mars? Or how does the magician deal with being in the emperor's domain? So I think it has given a bit of a leg up in some ways, because it just offers that other dialect, I like to say.
Cool. That sounds like a really interesting daily practice of checking the first hour, first planetary hour after sunrise, and kind of going through a bit of an analysis, kind of like how someone might do like a daily tarot spread. You're kind of incorporating the tarot symbolism into your astrology, but even just for someone wanting to get deeper into the astrology, I could see that being a really great practice. So yeah.
It was great. It was kind of inspired by like T. Susan Chang. She does this thing where you do a sort of 2-card pull every day and write a spell. I had shared that with a friend of mine, Tristan Paler, who's from Astrology Hotline, one of the co-hosts there. And then Tristan kind of was the one that inspired this practice in me. So it's been this like back and forth of sharing teachings, which is nice.
Awesome. And besides that, do you have any, so you said you're kind of circling back around and getting, obviously I want to like touch on the Decans, and then we'll get deep into the fixed stars as well later on. But like the astrology part, how do you go about like studying that or learning that?
I'm still sort of figuring that out, to be honest. Yeah, I'm trying to figure out, okay, like I know there's things where my language just isn't as nuanced as it would be for tarot. And really, I'm trying to just go back to kind of the first starting point and saying, okay, you know, what do I know about the planets? What do I know about the houses? And what do I know about the aspects and things like that? So I'm really trying to actively take that step back and rethink about, you know, I don't know exactly how each teacher does it, but you tend to start with things like you know, planet signs, stuff like that, and just going from there and trying to relearn and going back to kind of the like classic texts is pretty good. You can, you know, going to Lily and people like that and saying, what does this person have to say about this and how can I incorporate that in? I'm kind of jumping around right now, to be honest. But the like soup seems to be bubbling. At least it's. I think my literacy is stronger than I give myself credit for. I would think that that's a thing for anybody who's listening. Is, you know, if you're coming at it from the way that I came at it, at least, you probably know more than you think, even if you haven't trained in astrology to start. Just by like taking stuff in and listening to podcasts, you can still learn that way rather than, you know, taking a class to start off or getting certified by someone. I think that's great to do, but I don't think you have to start there.
Yeah, I think it kind of just depends on the like learning style and like the quality of materials you have access to and so on. And I can identify with that too. I think I studied pretty intensely for a year before I even like considered like even doing practice readings. And then I realized, wait, like I could speak for hours about a chart, even though I still don't feel like I'm super advanced in the astrology. So yeah, I can identify with that. And also, like, I'm curious about the doing of it. So like, you say you're jumping around, you have like, is it, you're sort of like looking at some charts and then be like, well, I don't know a lot about how this trine might work out. So you like pull open some books and like take some notes, or how does that look like for you?
Yeah, that's what I've been doing. And especially, I think it's a thing that many of us do, is that you pull on your friends, right? You pull on people that you have around you and you say, okay, well, what does this square say? Or what do I think I'm picking up on this square? And then talking to that person and saying, you know, this is what I kind of see here. How does that play out for you? You're the expert of your own chart. How does this feel if I kind of give you puzzle pieces or keywords to start with? Maybe they need to be massaged a bit, or maybe it's not exactly the kind of the scene that I've come up with, but you can work together to see how, if it's accurate or not, or how things need to shift, right? So there's a big barrier, like you said, to jumping into the doing. There's something about being able to do it with friends where it's just kind of like you're just riffing, or someone's coming over and you're hanging out. That takes off the pressure in a way, because there's no payment involved. That's a big one. And you're also not necessarily trying to do an entire chart reading. And someone's not coming, they're not seeking you out. You're just kind of saying, like, let's just do this together and have some fun. That's not to say I'm good at that, when like of adopting that mentality when it's time to eventually move into more, you know, paid work and things like that. But I think there's something there that when you're just trying and just figuring it out, and that how that trying becomes doing, there's that like boundary there that gets dissolved.
Yeah, I love that. So already there's like two great suggestions of the daily chart practice you talked about, and then I wish I'd gotten myself into the second practice a bit sooner, of like talking with other astrologically inclined friends.
Yeah.
about their charts, because that has been really informative for me as well. So cool, awesome. So I guess as we kind of move a little bit deeper on into the next part, you mentioned a Decan walk. So if you could just really briefly describe what a Decan is and the concept of a Decan walk before we move on.
Yeah. Yeah, so a decan, I imagine if you're listening, if you'll probably know that each sign is about 30 degrees of the zodiac. A decan is a 10-degree segment of that 30 degrees. So for example, right now, because we're right after the equinox, we're in Aries 1. So that kind of spans from 0. Some people say from 1 degree to 10 degrees, but from 0 degree of Aries until 10 degree of Aries. And that decan has certain qualities. It's administered by a specific planet, and it's not necessarily the planet that rules the sign. In the case of Aries 1, it is Mars, because it's one of those very, very Marsy decans, parts of the zodiac. And then the second decan would have slightly different qualities, and so with the third decan before switching over to Taurus. And a decan walk is, I'm most familiar with it, like I said, from tarot. So people who are more astrologically inclined might do different things, but basically you take that period of time, which is about 9, 10, sometimes 11 days, depending on just how the sun is progressing through the sky that year, and you kind of study that decan. And so you can do that by looking at texts. Like I said, you can go to the Picatrix images or Agrippa or the Yavana Jataka or Ibn Ezra. There's tons of texts that give you images from different time periods where people have tried to describe what is the quality of this kind of 10-ish period of the year, 10-ish day period of the year. But also you can just look at what's happening in your region, right? Like for me last year when I did my decan walk, I noticed that in Aries 1, that was the time that all the robins came back. So it was like the kind of beginning of spring, right? But also there is this quality for Aries 1 of like grabbing resources and kind of or like cracking open the earth to get it something new, or like clearing a forest to eventually build a house. And so it made me think about how the robins are continually, pecking at the ground to pull the resources up out of them. And I live near 2 big lakes, and it was in this decan last year that everybody started fishing again. So again, there's this idea of like this kind of forcefulness. There's this quality of hunting, which is associated with kind of Mars, which rules the decan, and this idea of like throwing the hook out into something to get resources, to pull resources out of the water. If you're doing it with a tarot card, you can look at how has that tarot card shown up for you, tracking your daily draws, or just saying like this period, you could say, what is Mars doing in the sky at this 10 days? And maybe Mars isn't even he's not right now, right? He's not even in his own decan, but what's he doing? How does that feel? What does that feel like? And how does that either exacerbate what's going on for me over these 10 days, or how does it affect the world around me over these 10 days? Things like that.
And so the tarot ties in, basically you have the decanic minors, so that's the numbered 2 through 10 cards of all 4 suits that correspond to each of the 36 decans.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. So for example, like all of the wands suit 2 through 10, they relate to all of the fire signs and kind of like the same sort of matching elementally for earth, water, and air. And so for in this case, you would look at the 2 of wands, and you would say for tarot, you could go, what does the 2 of wands, how does that contribute, or how does that meaning show up in the world around me? Or what does this time of year and the things that are happening have to say about the 2 of wands? How does it inform the meaning of that card potentially?
That's another great example of how the tarot and astrology really can be hand in hand. So if someone is into astrology and hasn't studied tarot, I recommend them to get into tarot as well, and vice versa, because they kind of feed off of each other a little bit. There's like the numbers 2, 3, and 4 cards are always going to be the cardinal signs
Yeah.
of that element. So it's really well integrated into like the astrology, not just like randomly assigned to the decan. So yeah, that's really cool. And I have some comments. I guess we can move right into fixed stars then, because you said your decan walk sort of shifted into a fixed star study, I believe you said.
Yeah.
I do have comments on the Aries one, but I want you to like bring in the fixed stars into that before I add anything to there.
Sure. Yeah, I wish this is even for me. Like I feel frustrated by this sometimes because I wish I knew when it started last year. I had heard of fixed stars before, and I'd seen some names. Right, you kind of you come across things like Regulus maybe, or some of the big players. I'd heard of them before, and I just thought, there's way too many to ever look into, so I'm not even going to bother with that. And sometime last year, I think it must have been around Aries 3 or Taurus 1. I don't know what sparked it. But I think it must have been that I realized that the stars have basically ecliptic coordinates, so degrees of the zodiac where they kind of fall onto. And now we can talk about this or not if you want, but some people would say that's like really doing the stars a disservice because you're trying to squish this circular thing onto an imperfect globe, right? But at that point I realized, people talk about how there are stars at different degrees in the different decans, and I started thinking, well, why not look at the stars that fall in a given decan and see how they influence the decan and see how they influence potentially the tarot card as well. And then just from there, that's what I did. Every single one that became my focus. I kind of did the other stuff like the grimoire images, but I always sped through them because I really wanted to get to like, what are the stars, and also what's the astrology of this, and who are the spirits kind of associated with this decan from the 36 eras of the zodiac, specifically a really ancient text, and like who are all these figures and what do they have to say. So that shifted pretty dramatically, and I went all the way around, all 360 degrees.
Wow. Well, I think you're in like a good grouping of people, because from my understanding, the stars have always been part of the decans from the earliest like Egyptian history, even though the decans have sort of moved with precession into new fixed stars.
Yeah.
If you want to just comment on that a little bit.
Yeah. It's ancient peoples have used the stars to kind of mark different significant dates for a long time, or they used it over thousands of years. Like you said, because of precession, they did shift. But like one of the most well-known famous examples is the star Sirius, which we're probably going to talk about a little later. Was that that kind of signaled to ancient Egyptians that the Nile was going to flood, right? So it was that the star was at a certain period of the sky at a certain time of year, and that coincided with this natural event that was also kind of cyclical. So they could kind of tie the things that happened seasonally at that time of year to the either the rising of the star or the culminating of the star, sometimes the setting of the star. And it's different across all sorts of cultures. Different cultures from Africa talk about setting stars and things like that, whereas sometimes it's only culminating or it's only rising. But yeah, people have been doing this for a long time, where they connect the decans to the stars.
Cool. And just like a side note of that precession, it kind of sort of bothered me a little early on. When I heard, I don't have access to 36 Faces, Austin Coppock's book on the decans myself yet. However, I've heard him refer to the idea that the decans have sort of collected meanings from the stars as the decans have moved position, so that even though some of the stars that were originally in the decan may no longer be, that meaning still is kind of lingers as part of the decanic meaning. And then that sort of like opened it up for me a little bit. It's like, okay, I can work with that concept.
Yeah, I've found it works a little bit like getting a tattoo in some ways, right? So originally, yeah, people kind of really tied those periods to those stars, and that's like when the tattoo is like fresh. It looks fantastic. It looks great. And then as you age and your skin naturally changes and you get older and it sags and the ink kind of fades, it's still the same tattoo, but it's just slightly different because it's literally moved a little bit on your skin, or the ink has spread out, right? So it's been very interesting to look, especially stars that are on the boundaries of a decan or that have like just hopped over from one decan to another, the ways that you can almost, I have found, you can almost see a star picking up the significations of the decan that's coming, like it's going to kind of either leach some of that meaning into it, or it's either pushing some of its meaning into that decan. It's been fascinating, and I don't know that it's universal, but they have an effect, I find.
That's really cool because it's starting to seem like a really dynamic system where stars are getting added to decans over time, and also you're incorporating some of the local place land-based events that happen around the time of the decans, and for us who practice like modern, like quote unquote Western tropical astrology, it's based on some Northern Hemisphere standards, but I imagine it's kind of something that could be a little more localized or customized, like sort of like how each astrologer develops their own system. A lot of possibilities are kind of popping up for me there.
And especially because the kind of other big system with stars is using parans, which is more of a visual phenomena, right? It's not about where is this star and how does you squish it down onto the ecliptic. It's where is this star in the sky currently, and like where can I see it, and how is it interacting with other planets or other stars in the sky. And that changes from season to season, right? So there's certain stars that totally disappear. There's certain stars you cannot see in certain hemispheres. So they're very local in that way too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would recommend, I'll add some, like a lot of notes to the show as well, like other podcast episodes to listen to, such as your appearance on Kyle Pierce's Astrology Hotline, where you talked about fixed stars, and some other ones as well that kind of go a little more into the mechanics of the parens and the difference between the ecliptic conjunctions and parens. Just so we don't need to like duplicate everything.
Cool.
So, but yeah, personally, I like the idea of both systems. The ecliptic, it is a projection and kind of squishing everything down. However, we do experience a lot of our astrology through the ecliptic. So it makes sense that there's a connection there. And at the same time, it's nice to have the parens as well that give more like full sky view of like where different stars are in comparison to like your current location. Kind of two different ways to bring in the stars that are very important. So awesome. And now I can give my comment about Aries 1, because when I was looking into it a little bit, because we're now in Aries 1, I looked at some of the stars, and I know we'll go a little more into like another decan, but I just wanted to throw something in about there's a star called Deneb Kaitos, which is in the constellation, I pronounce it Cetus, but you can
I say Cetus, but doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's better, closer to the Greek, I imagine. Which I was interested in. It's not one of I personally have been using Bernadette Brady's work primarily just as like a foundation to get me started.
That's a good starting place.
As I'm sure you know, she uses like about 64 stars. This star is not one of those. However, it is one that's on like one of my natal horizon or meridian. I don't remember which one. And what was interesting about that, if I remember correctly, it does currently project onto Aries 1, and it is in the tail of the sea monster. There's some interesting connotations with that, but in Arabic lore, it was one of its names was Difta Athani, the second frog, which I thought was really interesting because in my location, Aries 1 or around Aries 1 is where you start hearing the frogs, like the spring peepers come out, and it's like that's perfect because it's like that time and it's frogs, and even though it's like a different tradition of astrology, it just kind of winds up really cool, which I find that happens a lot with fixed stars. Now that I'm getting into them, you'll have things that seem like they shouldn't line up, but they kind of echo other parts of the astrology and like give different details. But yeah, just a little thing I thought I since you
They give us nuance in some way.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's the only thing I had with the Aries one. I just wanted to throw it in there, sort of phenomenological, and there's a word there for that. When you kind of observe the local environmental changes, I believe it's called phenology.
Okay.
When you sort of track, like, oh, when this flower blooms, like you can record it in your local area each year and sort of track that.
Yeah.
And it'd be kind of interesting to compare that sort of citizen scientist practice with things going on with the fixed stars and the Decans. So there's a project in there for someone who wants to
Totally.
that. Cool. Did you have? I think we wanted to. I believe you suggested we go a little more deeper into Pisces too.
Sure.
As an example of Decans and fixed stars, kind of interplaying and bringing some tarot as well.
Yeah, I want to point out too, like you're talking about Deneb Kaitos, is that I also love the stars that are not in Bernadette Brady's book. I know there's arguments. I love the ecliptic as well. I just I use it all the time. And I know there's some people who say it's, it should be based on the brightness of the star, and certain stars have more importance because of that. But I have found some wild synchronicities based on some of the like dimmest stars. And if you want, at some point I can tell this really an interesting personal anecdote that really gets at that, if you want, that I just thought was great. It convinced me, like, okay, this is why you use dim stars, basically.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, that'd be cool.
Sure. I've been also kind of working on this practice for a while, and it's been shifting, and I've been changing it, where I use tarot to kind of see which fixed star either has something to say about the day or might have an influence on the day, for example. So I'll draw a card, and if it's a decanic minor, right, one of those 2 through 10s, I'll take dice, specifically like usually a polyhedral dice of some kind. And it depends. Sometimes it's a 30-sided dice, or sometimes it's a 10-sided dice. And I'll roll it. And based on the combo of numbers, I'll look at an ecliptic coordinate and see what star is closest to that kind of combo of numbers. And I was recently, this last year, one of the reasons I was able to do a Decan walk is because I was going through an immigration process. So I'm immigrated from Canada to the United States, and I have not been able to work until really recently. So I had a lot of time on my hands. But I can't remember the star's name right now. I can look it up if we need to. But basically, I got a star that's pretty dim, and I don't know that there's a ton of lore behind it. Not that I was able to find anyways. But it was essentially its sole thing is that it is known as the bringer of good news. And when I got that, I tended to do this practice at night, because I thought, well, the stars are, more generally visible at night. So let's see how they either talk about the day that I had before, like leading up to that night, or the next day. And I thought, okay, well, I've been applying for jobs, so like maybe I'll hear back from one of those jobs. And the next day was when I got my letter saying your immigration process has been approved. And so it was like literally the best news I had been waiting for all year. But there's no other, like there's our other stars that you could say kind of have a similar quality to them. But just the fact that this star, as far as I know, has only this kind of one association with it, made me think, this is the astrology trying to pinpoint directly what's going on and trying to give that message as efficiently as possible. And so that was the thing where I was like, okay, I can't not use ecliptic degrees, and I can't not use dim stars, because they have something to say. It might be very specific, but they have something to say for sure.
Yeah, that's really cool, and like there are a ton of stars that say kind of the opposite thing too. So it's not just that stars are lucky. There's some pretty unlucky ones too. So yeah, that's really cool, and yeah, it makes me want to gives me additional impetus to stick with ecliptic conjunctions as well as other ways of looking at stars.
Totally.
That's a great story, and if you do remember the star, let me know, and I can like put it in the text part.
Sounds good.
It's part of our kind of modern compilation of meaning. I bet we can find more about the star if we look at charts and whatnot too at some point. Cool. That's a great story. Awesome. So, anything else before we kind of dive into Pisces 2?
Um, I think I have the star here. I pulled it up in the database that I've been creating. So it's Nishira in
Oh.
Capricorn. And that was also interesting because, you know, Capricorn, very well known for bureaucracy and systems and things like that. So this star that's in the sign known for those things would start telling me you're going to get this big good news from the like major bureaucratic organization in the country. So
I love it when the astrology just sings like that.
yeah, me too.
Well, in this case, it's even like the divination connected to the stars, but still, yeah, it's all kind of part of the same thing, I think. Cool. So Pisces 2, what drew you to kind of point out this one in particular?
This was one I worked on it relatively recently, right? Because we kind of just went through that about a month ago or so now, and there was something about it where it just jumped out to me in a way that made sense with both the Decan imagery, but also the tarot card meaning. So Pisces 2 is associated with the Nine of Cups. That is a card that a lot of people kind of colloquially call the wish card. But one of the hidden aspects of that card people talk about is the idea of like, be careful what you wish for, right? Because you might actually just get your wish. And a lot of the Decan images from that Decan, they're largely kind of women that are on boats, and sometimes they're in the middle of the ocean, and they're almost like pining for something that they can't see. They either want to go to land or they're thinking about going somewhere else. But there's a little bit of this quality of like the grass is always greener from Pisces 2. And a little bit from Nine of Cups, if you think about it, right? If you're hoping to have this kind of wish granted, you're hoping for something that you don't have right now. And I found the stars throughout that Decan were really interesting because they almost created this like siren song was the best way that I could think of it. So we can go through if you want, like I can talk about some of the stars that are in there and try to like parse out why I felt that way, or
yeah, let's go right ahead.
Sure. There's a lot of stars of Aquarius in there. One of them specifically is the star called Achisis or Achisis. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce that, but it is the water that flows from that flows out of Aquarius's urn. And there's a lot of things. There's some association with Aquarius's urn as though it's kind of like the primordial waters from which kind of everything emerges. And it got me thinking about all of these different types of stories from various regions and different like figures and different spirits. So for example, in like Basque country, there are these figures called they're sometimes called Lamia, which is very similar to like a Greek monster, but you can also call them they're called Lamina or Laminac. And they're these like siren creatures who call to people and kind of ask you to come, and they can sometimes spell your doom potentially. But also there's this idea that the rainbow is created from them like combing their hair and the sun glinting off their hair. So there's this kind of watery spirit who has this quality with, you know, beauty and allure and money and kind of like wishes being granted on the other side of the rainbow, stuff like that, but also peril, right? Because sirens kind of typically, it doesn't end up too well for people who are hearing the siren song. And that was sort of the thing that was all throughout that Decan. There's Achernar is also in that Decan, which is the brightest star in the river in Eridanus. And this one is, you know, really pulling on writings by Sasha Ravich, which I know you know as well. But she sees that star as this kind of like underwater king who's sort of asking you potentially to join his underwater kingdom of the dead. But it's this ability to either kind of just surrender, and sort of like in that surrender, you get to become more than just the physical world. You get to experience spirituality It's this kind of like beautiful nihilistic quality of like, why go for where you are now, and why not just like give up, and in the giving up you can kind of become something new. But there's all of these themes of seeing something and being drawn in by something that seems really beautiful and alluring on the surface, but underneath there's this really dire consequences, which I think gets at also the idea of the tarot card, right? That you have to be careful what you wish for, and relates to those Decan images as well, that are these people kind of pining for something that they don't have in front of them. What I find really interesting, go for it, go ahead.
Oh, no. I have a question, but I think go ahead first.
Okay, cool. One thing that I find particularly interesting about that Decan as a whole, too, is that in 36 Heirs of the Zodiac, which is this kind of ancient text that's from kind of Hellenized Egypt, basically, that text kind of associates different gods or different spirits or diamonds with the Decans. And the one for Pisces 2 is Dolos. Or actually, am I getting that correct? I want to just double check. Yeah, I did. Okay, good. I questioned myself, but it's Dolos, and that's the spirit of trickery. And Dolos's whole thing is basically that he was Prometheus's kind of sidekick, protege, and Prometheus was creating the goddess of truth, and he left for a while, and Dolos made an exact replica of the goddess, but he kind of either ran out of clay and couldn't make her feet, or he kind of purposefully mangled the feet. But Prometheus, when he came back, he decided, you know what, we'll put them both in the kiln, and we'll leave it up to humanity to find out who's who. And so maybe Truth is the one with the hobbled feet, maybe she isn't the one with the hobbled feet, but that there's this constant interplay in this Decan of what is real and what is true versus what is unreal and what is not true, or what is kind of looks beautiful but might have this facade behind it versus what might look kind of ugly and disheveled, but is actually, you know, the kind of like classic ugly duckling kind of syndrome, right?
It makes me kind of think of like the water sort of glittering on top, but there might be a lot underneath, like a crocodile awaiting or something.
Exactly. Yeah. And it just like every star in that Decan, there was also like Enka, which is the brightest star. Phoenix, same thing, right? Like, so there's this whole idea of you need to perish to be able to rise again. But there's over and over and over again just this theme of like, just give up and enjoy the giving up into something, and don't really pursue beyond what you have, because this is good here.
Wow. So yeah, that all ties together very nicely, in ways that wouldn't be obvious just looking at the tarot or just looking at like the Decanic imagery or the stars. And just real briefly, so you talked a little bit about these like Decan images, and so I'm sure listeners who've heard of Decans know that there are these sort of mysterious images or descriptions of images associated with each Decan. And what do you make of those? Like as you're studying, like what do you do with them, or how do you sit with them in a way that's sort of nourishing, I guess?
Sure. I've done different things. One of the things I've done is I try to figure out, especially when I'm looking at stars, every once in a while there's like a figure from one of the stars. You can say a spirit or a mythological figure, just kind of depends on your worldview, right? But that almost seem like they're the figure in the Decan image. So every once in a while I'm like, oh, that's the woman on the boat. She's right there. She's in this star, right? Or this is a dog-headed man holding a key. They don't maybe necessarily get that specific, but you can sometimes find figures from the stars in the Decan images. Another thing I was doing more so when it was kind of just a tarot Decan walk rather than a star-focused Decan walk is trying to see people in the real world that were those people. I think it's in Virgo 3. There's this image of a man who's just wearing layers and layers and layers of clothing. He's like wrapped up in multiple layers, or maybe he's got like a shirt on, and over top of the shirt he has like a an apron, and over top of that he has something else. But there's this idea of like multiple layers of clothes. And in that Decan, I saw someone who was wearing, they had like shorts on, but underneath the shorts, they had that kind of like athletic compression wear. And then they had a sort of basketball jersey, but they had a, what was it, like a turtleneck under that, and then like a big puffy coat. And over that big puffy coat, there was a scarf. So it was just, it also helps you kind of see those people out and about. And they might not show up exactly as the Decan does, but you can be like, ah, that's who this is.
It's a good indication that you're touching on something real when you see the Decan image while you're experiencing that Decan. So.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Also, are there anything else with Pisces 2 that you wanted to touch on?
Let me double check.
Oh, I can just see a few notes as well that I had while you're looking.
Yeah, go for it.
I know that different authors have like attributed different names to the Decans. Austin Coppock called the Pisces 2 the net, which seems appropriate given that you're capturing the success, but with the success or fulfillment, you might be getting something a bit more dangerous as well. Like
Yeah.
a lot of things. And then T. Susan Chang calls it fishes and wishes.
Yeah.
As I'm sure you know. And the Hermetic title is happiness or material happiness. Anything else you'd like to add on top of that?
Yeah, I think that the idea with it being the net, I think Austin took inspiration from the idea of Indra's net a little bit when he named that one. And I'm not super familiar with Indra's net, but my understanding is that it's this kind of like faceted crystalline net that reflects every other portion of reality within every facet, right? So it is this, if I'm getting it correctly, this kind of representation of the physical world, but it's also pointing out the fact that the physical world in and of itself is a net as well, right? That you're kind of trapped in it, and you need to be able to see the spiritual net behind the physical world to truly understand how to actually move between the different nodes on the net. So
the net of the physical world containing both ecstasy and agony at the same time.
Exactly, yeah.
And you can get sucked into that, similarly to how some of these big star spirits seem to want to like suck people into their realms, versus like trying to step outside of that net as like a spiritual practice. It's very interesting. Cool. Yeah.
And being so close to the end of, the zodiac as we know it now, it's interesting that it's like, Pisces is kind of the period of time where things come to an end. And so it's people joke, it's the cosmic dustbin or whatever, but especially in Pisces 3, there's all these images of people who have spent all their energy, like they're just wiped of energy and they're kind of just lounging and relaxing. So it's almost like this Decan before that is trying to be like, just soak into the water, like just let yourself drown down or just kind of like disappear into the collective unconscious of the universe before that spark for spring, right? At least in the northern hemisphere, but before Aries 1 comes and says, no, wake up, there's more life to be had, right? So it's nice, like
survival. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah,
really cool. And just a side, I'll throw in a few more references of other videos that I've seen recently. At first it seemed kind of, I guess, arbitrary that we end with Pisces. But then I recently saw, and I'll admit only about half so far, of a video that Gemini Brett released, where he kind of explains the astronomy behind the Aries season and why it's the beginning. And I won't attempt to repeat it myself because it's a little fresh. But I'll put a link to that too, because it gives a really great justification for like the tropical approach to astrology, that is following like the seasons versus like the sidereal, attempting to align with the stars.
Yeah.
They're basically like the Aries point. I'll just say it makes sense as the beginning of the year. So that helped me with that. And then for the Decans, there's another channel on YouTube called, I believe it's Hellenistic Astrology, that I recently discovered. And luckily I discovered them just as they finished up basically a Decan by decan deep sort of discussion and exploration.
Yeah.
So now it's a great reference, and I believe they're, as a group, going through it again this year.
That's Ryan Butler, right? I think is his name.
This is a few people. I'll mention it. It's not Ryan Butler. It's he does the medieval astrology, and his channel is great too for elections. But yeah, it's a group of, I believe, 3 folks who go through each decan and talk about material from astrocosmic and some other texts and images, and then they kind of go more deeply into each decan. So it's something I'll be doing, like reviewing each of those as we go through, because I kind of got sucked into the decans and fixed stars as well. Yeah, I'll link that as well. I'll send that to you too. It's
yeah, please do.
Can't believe I hadn't seen it before, but yeah, decans are great. Cool. So I think we had something else that we wanted to go into just to illustrate. It's an intense example,
it is.
But it does illustrate kind of the power, or just the really intense relevance of the fixed stars. And in this case, it's via conjunction to the ecliptic. And I'll try sharing my screen, but currently I'm using a program where it kind of flips back and forth based on who's talking. So I'll put a link to the chart. And it's a chart that's for the Trinity nuclear test, which was I'll just read a little bit from Wikipedia, just so we get a little background. It's the code name. Trinity is the code name of the first detonation of a nuclear weapon. It was conducted at 5:29 a.m. on July 16th, 1945, as part of the Manhattan Project, testing like the first nuclear weapons. And it was tested in the Jornada del Muerto Desert, about 35 miles southeast of Socorro, New Mexico. And so that is what we needed to generate a chart for that. And so I'll try sharing this chart real quick. Present window, this one. And okay, so this shows the a chart. We have Cancer rising, and I've kind of noted some of the fixed stars here, although it kind of just shows the first 4 letters. But it's at least something to refer to as we talk about each of those stars. And so why don't we just jump in? You mentioned that we would talk about Sirius, a star from Canis Major, I believe.
Yep, that's right.
Well, and I'm interested too, because I have a few Sirius parents, and I know Sirius can get a bit intense. So
yeah, absolutely.
Interested to hear whatever we can learn from that.
Yeah. Let's go with it. Sirius is the brightest star in the sky, and it's been traditionally known as the scorcher. It's got all of these associations with fire. Different people talk about kind of immortal fire, but it's often associated, like that's where we get the term the dog days of summer. It's because that's when the dog star is rising. But so all throughout history, throughout different eras, it is associated with these really, really intensely hot days, kind of in the middle of summer. So because of that, it does have this quality of kind of being consumed by flame, or being burnt away, or kind of having a radiance that's, too difficult to take. Austin talks about it specifically as this idea that it's like the fire of the gods in some ways. And sometimes people with Sirius parens, they'll kind of burn themselves up in the pursuit of wanting to kind of be amongst the gods. I've sort of seen before too. But I find this interesting that, it's pretty tightly conjunct the ascendant. Like it's within a few minutes of the ascendant, I think, if I remember correctly. So it's just interesting that it's like the dawn of this kind of burning, or the birth of this kind of burning, scorching fire, which you could kind of say is also like the fire of the gods, because it was this energy that up until that point humanity had not really been able to unlock, right? And that it just kind of like smites things in the way that classically you would see a deity like smite someone or strike someone down if they did something that they didn't quite like.
Yeah, and like a lot of these fixed star meanings, it's kind of very on the nose in a way that all you have to do is know some of the associations of the star and that it's connected in some way, and you can already just like with very little background kind of bring not that you don't have background. I'm just saying like
Yeah,
the fixed stars are very loud, I guess
they
is a way
are.
of saying, and also Saturn is very close to the ascendant as well. So just kind of increasing the importance of that connection.
Yeah, and also I think it's gonna be grim. I think we can just put the sort of trigger warning that this will be a grim discussion throughout. So, but that it's a little bit, Saturn's not too far behind the ascendant in this case, and so it's like the birth of death by this immortal flame in some ways, right?
Yeah, yeah. Cool. Well,
Yeah.
not cool, but
Interesting. A friend of mine and I coined this thing when, like, how you can say like astrology good. We always say it's mystical.
mystical. Yeah. Okay, so I see that there's several more stars here. What's the next one that you think is?
Why don't we just go kind of in the order like of the horizon? So we'll just start with Sirius and kind of like work our way up to Rigel there in Gemini and kind of so on and so forth. If that sounds good.
Yeah,
cool.
Great.
Rigel is in Orion, and it's kind of like at his foot. And this star isn't really known, at least as from what I have learned, isn't super known for devastation. It's actually known a little bit for things like enlightenment or kind of starting yourself off on that journey of enlightenment. Which I guess like you could point out that this still was a pretty big scientific discovery, despite its implications. But it is in Orion, which keep in mind is the warrior, the hunter, like cross-culturally for thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands of years. That's one of the earliest constellations, if you go back, is Orion. And Orion, at least in Greek mythology, was struck down because he was sort of, in one account, he was basically bragging that he could kill every animal on Earth. There was no animal that would be able to get away from him. So again, it's just this potentially this possibility of, especially being in like the 12th on this chart, that there's this kind of like hidden aspect of this thing where this sort of hubris of being able to just kind of decimate or destroy any animal or any animal, humans being animals as well, is that sort of like hidden thing that we can't see here.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, and sorry, I realized that this chart I did not have the outer planets put in, so I was wondering for a second why Rigel was there. But I'll switch out the charts. It's there because Uranus is conjunct.
Yeah, right.
Degree of Rigel. So yeah.
Cool. I know some people do use outer planets with stars, some people don't. I haven't jumped into them personally, but I think I found this is a pretty a good case. But
sure. And so next is Aldebaran conjunct Venus in Gemini.
Yeah. This one I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it too. I don't know exactly if how Venus plays a part, but Aldebaran is the eye of Taurus. It's this red star. It's sometimes known as like the fiery or bloodshot eye of the bull. And in different ways, like this is one of the big stars in the sky. It's one of the royal watchers, the Persian royal watchers. So it has been known for a long time. It's had a very prominent place for people and for cultures. But there is some associations with that star and the archangel. Oh, now I'm going to forget who it is. The one who is kind of like at the leader of God's army. I think Michael, if I'm remembering correctly. I'm pretty sure that's the one.
I believe so. Michael's more of the protective, sort of like battle-oriented archangel, if I can remember. Yeah.
And I think that's pertinent, but what is more pertinent is that there's also sometimes an association with that star. And sometimes Michael, like it's kind of a apocryphal. You don't know if this is, who's writing this necessarily, but that Michael is also the horseman of war out of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, that he kind of like dons this other guise at that period of time. So again, it's cool. Mystical that there's this figure of the kind of apocalyptic representation of war. Like that's, I mean, of course, all the stars would be in every chart, but that there's a contact specifically going on there.
Sure, and I could bring in a little bit of the astrology because I haven't looked into this chart a lot. But Venus is ruling Libra, which is the 4th house, and Taurus, which is the 11th house. And I could kind of see it as, in some sense, if we assume some of the best intentions of the people who did this test, the idea might be to protect home and like society. So like 4th house, 11th house, kind of basic house significations. And then it's in the 12th, which it can be the place of self-undoing as well. And then if you bring in those sort of Michael associations, some Michael prayers I've heard invoke Michael and his flaming sword to protect. And like a nuclear weapon is sort of like the most flaming sword one can imagine.
Totally.
So I can definitely see it tying in for sure.
And then the next one in there, is, you know, classic. Probably if you've heard of a star, the one you've probably heard of is Algol. I think, Kyle and I talked on it when I was on his podcast as well, because it's so well known and everybody wants to know about it, right? But it's kind of self-explanatory. Like it's almost so on the nose in this situation, being conjunct Mars in particular. But Algol is the head of Medusa, and technically in Perseus, but it's like it's on its own constellation. But sometimes I think of it that way, right? That there's Perseus, and then specifically Medusa is this like powerful figure. And this is a very interesting star. If you're interested in this, I would say check out the work of Amaya Rourke in particular. She is really, really connected to this star. She has a lot to say about it, and she's got some classes that really, really go into the mythology behind this star. But at the kind of like Cole's notes of it is that Algol can sometimes represent this sort of primal power. That's sometimes why she can be associated, I find, with things like electrical discharges or electrical malfunctions, because she's almost just like the stuff that the Big Bang is made of. And she is like a terraformer. So it's like it's the way that the water meets with fire, which creates land, which is, inherently this sort of cataclysmic event, and it creates something, but it is horrifically destructive in the process of creation. But she also points out things that are like flawed in the system. If you have Algol in your chart, she can sometimes point out the thing of like, what do you need to purge from yourself for your own ecosystem to be properly maintained and to have like homeostasis and stuff like that. So she's kind of almost, I think she's playing like double duty here. She is both on helping people kind of unlock that primal energy, literally like inside the atom in some ways, but and especially being, conjunct Mars, using that for weapons and war and stuff like that. But I think she's also pointing out the inherent ecological disaster that this this kind of creates, right? So I don't know if she's necessarily always like not ambivalent is the word I'm looking for, but she's just kind of saying like, you can figure this out on your own. I'm just here. I'm going to be the thing that shows you this, and it's up to you to deal with the ramifications of it.
Yeah, like I'm going to make you see the horror of how you've used this, and then do with it what you will.
Yep, totally.
Okay, I guess that leads us to this is another pronunciation thing. Shayat or Shiat? How do you say this one?
That's how I've been saying it. This is the thing you're going to hear with stars in general, is that everyone's got a different way of saying stuff for the most part, or like constellation, stuff like that too.
Right.
That is basically like that is a star in Pegasus, and it's also like the final star in Pisces 3 before the vernal equinox. So what I was finding interesting about this one in particular is that it does have that quality of like hard stop, right? Like just the end of the end before the overturning of a new era, or just, you could say, death just things like destruction. It's also interesting that it's on the MC, thinking about how that's where eventually, atomic bombs were dropped, stuff like that. And Pegasus was also, this star in particular, lots of stars in Pegasus kind of in the older texts get associated with things like death by fire, death by accidents. They're pretty malefic stars for people. Like when you look back, the same way that you'd older astrologers would, kind of go with the worst examples of something. But what is interesting is that Pegasus, one of the main myths is that he was the steed that Bellerophon rode to try to like achieve his time with the gods. So he kind of got, again, too big for his britches. He got on Pegasus and he rocketed off to Mount Olympus, and the gods struck him down. So there's this kind of quality sometimes of is it okay to swear on the podcast? I just want to check.
Oh yeah.
Great. I think this sometimes this is more of a just kind of, it sounds the same, but there's a little bit of like eating shit with this star in some ways. Yeah, especially considering that it is, again, like the last star at the end of the zodiacal year. But Bellerophon, if I'm remembering correctly, his name does have associations with things like missiles. So there's this whole thing wrapped up in here of like falling from grace, being struck down by this kind of eternal fire or lightning, death by flame, death by accident, and also like literal missiles and kind of like bolts of divine power.
And almost like it sounds like a hubris or an overreach as well, kind of another lesson even built in while also describing like the event itself.
Yeah, totally.
Definitely mystical.
Yeah.
Okay. That lines up pretty well too.
Yeah.
Next is one that I hadn't heard myself before you pointed it out. And I don't even, what was the full name of that one in Capricorn? And that is, conjunct the descendant.
Let me double check that one, because it's also slipping my mind now. So let me check over here.
I think it's like Meridanus or something like that.
That's what it is. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, great. Just small enough that I was like, is that an M? But yeah, okay. This is Meridiana. Yeah. So this is in the constellation of the Southern Crown. There's the Corona Australis. There's also Corona Borealis, which a lot of people know. That's kind of the crown of Ariadne specifically. But Meridiana is the brightest star in the Southern Crown, which does have some Greek associations. But in Chinese star lore, this portion of the sky is associated with this sort of like great black turtle. And one of the myths that's associated of kind of like the origin of this turtle is there was this warrior. I'm probably going to get the pronunciation of his name wrong, but I think it's something like Xuan Wu. I apologize if I've totally butchered the inflections there. But he essentially wanted to achieve transcendence. So he kind of went off into the wilderness and thought about, how can I do this? How can I do this? And he figured that the best way to do it was to literally purge his body of the sin that he carried in him by kind of cutting out his own stomach and his intestines. And when he did that, the intestines that were kind of like mucked up by sin turned into this giant turtle and a giant serpent, basically, that went on a rampage and destroyed the countryside. And eventually he does kind of like calm them down. He figures out how to cleanse them and cleanse himself. But again, it was just kind of this idea I was thinking about of this monster that you release and you don't even know the implications of it, and that it's just gonna kind of wreak havoc on its own.
Yeah, I mean, that one kind of gave me chills for some reason.
Okay.
Because definitely, I mean, it's a peril we still kind of live under today, even though it doesn't feel as intense as I imagine it did during the Cold War. But yeah, for sure. Okay, yeah, that's not a story that I had heard before. So that's definitely, it's nice to kind of take a look at other cultures' star lore as well, and not like try to appropriate it, but it does it does show that like the sky is the sky, and like a lot of times you find repeating themes and motifs even amongst cultures that presumably haven't had contact in thousands and thousands of years. So yeah, that was a great kind of like study in like that sort of, you know, exploration, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, you'll come across a ton of Greek star lore in particular, of course, just because of like the sort of the way the Western world in particular is influenced by Greek culture and things like that. But a lot of stars, there's a lot of Arabic star lore. Most stars have Arabic origin of their name. But I love learning about the star lores from kind of across cultures because of that very reason. There's some sections of the sky that feel like they just are communicating the same theme, and that people were just picking up on it in slightly different ways, and it was finding its way into their culture just kind of differently. But at its core, it gets at something that happens way more often with stars than you would think.
Cool. Okay, so to move right along, the next to last star that we wanted to look at was Algorab.
Yeah,
the moon.
yeah, and that is Algorab is in Corvus, so that's the raven. And this one is interesting because again, Greek mythology, you're going to pull on here. The raven is kind of the messenger of Apollo. And typically the star is associated with things like slander and ill words and things like that. It can be things just like gossip as well, but kind of like these ill winds in some ways. That's, I think, interesting, especially like you were pointing out that it's in the fourth, right? That there's this kind of association between this quality of like what news is getting out of the home or kind of out of the country in some ways, what news is coming in, what news do we want to get out versus not. But what I thought was cool for this star was that Apollo is often seen as both this deity of the sun, but he's also a deity of plague, right? So he has the ability to both cure illness, but also he can bring plague and death down upon people with his arrows. I was thinking about this this morning, and I was joking that he's basically the lord of fusion and fission, right? Being the sun in some ways. So it's like his messenger. It's not necessarily that he is there, but it's like his messenger is there saying, you know, this is coming. This is you have my master or my patron that is going to be behind you, this lord of atomic energy, and it's kind of up to you to see what you're going to do with that thing. And also there's kind of this general association with ravens of like omens. I mean, obviously like omens in general, but sometimes omens of death, right? Ill omens, and saying they speak death into being at times. So channeling that energy through its beak to try to tell people or to warn people or to just bring in what it's speaking about.
Yeah, and like something you said, it was kind of sticking with me of the ill winds and kind of the associations with the pestilence, and how it's not just the initial kind of conflagration that is a big part of it, but kind of bringing in the kind of basic astrology of, you have the ruler of the ascendant, which is the moon, conjunct Algorab. So it's kind of like, yes, initially you have the conflagration, the serious burst, and then it moves, like the ruler of the ascendant moves to Algorab, which you end up with that sort of like radioactive issues, and even like spreading like literally through winds, blowing the radioactive material further. I'm not sure if it happened exactly in this case, but I assume that it did.
I think there was at least some sort of fallout, right? Like there's no way that there's not in this situation.
So another mystical point in favor of the fixed stars.
Yeah.
Okay, and then finally we have Markeb, near to, I believe it was that Neptune that we're looking at there.
I think so.
Either Jupiter or Neptune. I'd have to look at the points. But it's conjunct something.
Yeah, totally.
And so tell us a little bit about Markeb, which
Sure.
I've heard of Markab, but I believe they're different stars.
They are different. Yeah. They come from the same word, which is basically the idea of like something to ride. Markab is also in Pegasus, but Markeb is in Vela, which is part of the Argo, right? The ship of the Argonauts. But yeah, they come from the same root word in Arabic, which kind of I've read gets its associations of like riding something, or kind of I guess just that, riding something. This is totally, like, I will admit, I don't think anybody else would have this association with the star. It's a pretty dim star. It's not super well known. But when I've tried to think of this star, because it's in the sail, but it's in the ship. So I've been thinking about Markeb specifically as like the ferry that goes back and forth between kind of the realm of the living and the realm of the dead, sort of like Charon type figures in Greek mythology. And then the even bigger stretch I have is that it makes me think sometimes of Earendil, and as he's like kind of flying around, holding onto the Silmarillion or the Silmaril, and that he's only going to return at the Dagor to basically like fight, which will kind of end the world and usher in the next world as well. There's some association, like that's not exactly the star lore that I know Tolkien went with in his own astrology. I do know that like the Silmaril and Earendil is supposed to be an association or a representation of Venus. So that is like, I don't think like Tolkien or Lord of the Ring heads would really vibe with this one, but that's the way I've kind of thought about it, is that ship that is either like really, really far away and kind of can go between, Middle Earth and the faraway lands and things like that, or that it's going to return. In this case, it's returning at the sort of apocalyptic end of the world to usher in that next era.
Well, I'm all for the Tolkien. Like, I've read the Silmarillion a few times. So sorry, it was conjunct the Descendant. I'm sorry, not the Descendant, the IC. So
okay.
I'm just like less than 2 degrees off. So it's pretty close.
Cool.
Like I think it's great to get a little creative with the associations and leave it a little open and flexible. Because maybe other people might find that connection useful as well, and then we can sort of build on that. I love that association with Earendil. Great. So that was our last star in this intense chart overview. So definitely, I mean, I'm sure that the chart, like I didn't do like an analysis of the whole chart, but I'm sure, like, just if you remove the fixed stars, the chart probably tells a similar story. But when you bring them in, it really like shines a light on what happened here at this event, which is really interesting to look at.
Yeah, I think they just get it something. It gives you different vocabulary to pull from, perhaps, or like, again, if these are stars, if you know the mythology of these stars or these figures, like in your own cultural context, that gives you something else to pull from with figures and people and potentially, morals and lessons and things like that. But it just blows open the chart in a way that you can start to see narratives, because these stars are kind of like hooked with narratives in some ways.
Yeah, for sure. And okay, just to start wrapping up, I did want, since we went into this sort of intense example and talked about some of the scarier associations of the stars, I did want to at least mention on my end that I recommend getting into the fixed stars by looking at some of the more modern works of like the author Bernadette Brady, because she gives more nuanced meanings versus some of the more like intense, scary meanings, which are still present in the stars, but that's not all. And if you start getting into it, I was first kind of put off by the stars reading like Vivian Robson's stuff, and like it's some great stuff, but it's kind of summarizing some of this older material that tends to be more intense. And in the Hellenistic period, especially, and through the medieval period, I personally feel like some of the astrologers were not as connected to the fixed stars as I believe some of us are trying to be today,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
how many humans throughout history have been more connected to the stars, and more of a, you know, interpersonal way where they're not just a list of dire meanings, they are beings, and
Yeah.
or I mean, however you want to look at it through your own personal metaphysics, there are many ways of kind of looking at like what the stars are and how they influence life. Uh, like, what are your thoughts with all of that jumble of things that I said?
I totally agree. Yeah, like I would say that is one of the things that the stars have really taught me over the last year, and really changed my worldview around over the last year too, is that one of the reasons why I was so averse to getting into astrology beforehand is because frankly, I was afraid of the universe in some ways, right? Like anytime I would think about transits or get to look too closely at like my own natal chart, I would start to stress out because I was like, oh God, what's going to happen with Mars, right? Like I just finished my Saturn return and stuff like that. And so it just put me in this place of like, oh God, it seems like the universe is out to get me and that you should be stressed and anxious. And it is really, I think you're right. Like the older writers in particular, it's tons of doom and gloom. But if you are able to develop personal relationships with these stars, either through like your chart or if there's a star that you feel particularly drawn to, you can learn about that star and how it affects you, especially, and they can absolutely become like allies and teachers. And if you do spirit work, there are whole groups of people who are talking about the different spirits that are associated with each star, and that you can call on them for allyship or create pacts with them. And it has, I think, made me more of a friend of the universe, because it just shows that there's these figures out there that are kind of always looking over you, and they might, as you develop personal relationships with them, you can see the way that they like affect you and are potentially even the like meanest stars, quote unquote, like Algol. If you have Algol in a significant part in your chart, you can work with her to help you unlock stuff, or to like help you bring your ecosystem into homeostasis and things like that. So that's totally changed. Like I would say even 6-7 months ago, I was like, I don't want to look at a transit. Now I'm like, let's do it. Let's see what we have, because I have all of these allies that I can pull on.
Yeah, I love that. It's I've sort of evolved into seeing the fixed stars as sort of these almost the purest facets of the divine that we can have access to.
Yeah.
It's like one of the lenses I'm sort of seeing it as, and yeah, they can be allies. I mean, but like just like the divine sort of incorporates everything, all of experience. You have the terrible and the beautiful all in one, and recognizing that you already have connections via conjunctions in your chart or via the system of Purans. Like you're already connected to these stars, and so just kind of learning about that and digging in, it does make you feel a bit more resourced, or have more of a foundation for approaching sort of the ups and downs of life. So
yeah
for sure. Yeah, awesome. And I think you had some books that you wanted to share, as some of your favorite kind of explorations of fixed stars.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say we hit on a couple already, but like Brady's Book of Fixed Stars, absolutely, I would go with that one. This one I've used like every day since I've got it. This is a 2-book set, but they're
Ooh, yeah.
Secrets of the Ancient Sky by Diana Rosenberg.
Yeah,
They're
that's on my list.
It's on your list?
I can't wait to get it.
Get it. This is the second one. So there are these huge tomes. They're a little like, they're steeply priced for the set of them. Like for 2, it's about $100 US. So yeah, keep that in mind. It's also it's a little bit weird, because even if you go to the website, it'll reroute you through eBay, but that's fine. That is normal. That is how they sell the books. Unfortunately, Diana has passed, and that's her family sells the books, and that's just the way they've chosen to kind of like sell the books. It's the easiest to do it that way. So it's great. Like it goes through it goes through even more than decans. It goes through sometimes like 2 or 3 degrees of the zodiac at a time, and shows you like what are the stars in here, and then talks about how they influence a person born at that like 4-day period, and then gives you pages and pages and pages and pages of examples. And the first one goes into a lot of specifically Chinese star lore, and talks to you about like what are these asterisms and what did they potentially mean to the ancient Chinese, and like what would this have meant culturally and things like that. So that one, I think, even for that last part of the book about ancient Chinese asterisms, it's invaluable for sure.
Cool. Yeah, I'll put a link to all of these
Great.
in the bottom in the notes.
Cool.
And any other resources you'd like to mention?
Yeah, I would say I'm trying to think of other
For
books.
sure, I'll have links for Sasha Ravich's and Maya Rourke's works.
Yeah.
And they get further into like that devotional aspect, and recommend digging into that as well.
Totally. Yeah. Another big one I would say is you can actually find this online, as far as I know. Like I believe it is on the author's website. But if you look up Star Tales by Ian Ridpath, that's really good. Like I would say if you can't afford Diana Rosenberg's book, start with Ian Ridpath, because he also goes into the kind of like association specifically in China too, but he goes through and he talks about a lot of those stars and kind of breaks them down in a similar way she does. So I would start there. There's also a website by a woman named Judy Volker, and it's got different mythology from around the world and star lore from around the world, from lots of different cultures. So
Cool. Yeah, I'll have links to those as well. Awesome. So before we kind of wrap up, do you have anything else that you'd like to share?
The thing I thought is just specifically like you're pointing out with the devotional work and things like that, right? That they do show you the horrific and the beautiful. Like I want to say that's really true. In like even for me, my heliacal rising star is Spica, and like over the last year in particular, she has taught me so much about kind of like my relationship to like my parents and stuff like that, which is a pretty fraught thing. But she's there, right? Like she kind of points out these things, that these dynamics potentially, but she also has helped me like immeasurably over the last year, just kind of look at those wounds and heal them and think about them in a different way. So I think just to point out that you're saying, yeah, they do show you both. They have a larger understanding of the universe than we could ever possibly, and so they're really worth getting into. I think like this has been a life-changing thing for me in some ways. So I would encourage as many people as possible to get into the fixed stars.
Sure, and I actually have the same heliacal rising star, because
I didn't know that. That's cool.
Yeah, so that's one of the ones I wanted to get to know a little further. I know in my work, I think she suggests that that's a pretty easygoing one. I mean, some stars are more intense or difficult, but that's because it almost felt like Hobbit energy, really, when I was reading about it.
Totally. And she is in like the Vedic lunar mansion system. She is the star that is kind of like the anchor point in some ways for all of the other stars that the lunar mansions associate with. So I found that particularly interesting, because it's like just being, again, interested in fixed stars. I believe Sasha Ravich has some Spica stuff going on in her chart as well. And it's just interesting that like people who are drawn to the stars have this, not just this star, but I've loved that it's like getting obsessed with the structure of the stars, and there is Spica, who's at the center of them all.
Awesome. Cool. So is there anything anything that you're kind of up to, or like that you'd like to point people to if they'd like to connect with you?
Sure. Yeah, I am that kind of tarot star divinatory technique that I've been working on It's in development, and I wanted to kind of wait until I was done my Decan walk because I didn't feel like it would be right to start working with people if I didn't know all the stars and couldn't speak to some of them. And so eventually I'm going to start reaching out to. I'd like to reach out to people to just kind of like experiment with. But so if you're interested in kind of helping me develop that technique where you use tarot as kind of a gateway to stars, I would love to hear from you. We can work on that together. I would say the kind of best way to find me is on Instagram for the most part. It's just, I think if you look up my name, Silverius Materi, there's not really anyone else out there with that. And my handle is Silver Materi. It's like silver, like the metal, Mattereye. And yeah,
I'll have a link to that as well. And also put a link. We met through the Three of Wands Discord, which is a nice little community of like tarot and astrology enthusiasts. And I believe if anyone would like to join, it's pretty inclusive.
Very open.
Yeah, I'll put a link to that as well. I'm sure if anyone listens to the end of this video, they're probably a great fit for the community.
Totally. Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. So I think that about wraps it up. It's been a great time talking with you. I had a great time.
I had a wonderful time. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So awesome. Yeah, that's a wrap.
Great.